My uncle helped me succeed, and I never saw my parents again after they sent me to live with him. I now have a home and a company, and I finally told my biological father that he wasn't a good father. While my dad, who was a prosperous businessman at the time, began to face severe financial difficulties in his company while I was just a teenager, my family suffered a terrible loss. His business partner even stole some of the company's money at one point, which made it impossible for my dad to continue running the company. He was compelled to shut down the company entirely. My father had always been a proud man, who took great pride in his company. But he became utterly sad when he abruptly lost his lone source of money. He had always been a rock for our family, and someone we all admired for his diligence and commitment, as well as the decency and grace with which he conducted himself in all that he did. His company was more than simply a means of making money. It was a manifestation of his goals, his dreams, and the years of hard work he had put into it. It seemed like more than just a monetary loss. When it fell apart, it was like a piece of him was missing. For our family, this loss was about the uncertainty that followed, not just the money or the company itself. One of the worst things I have ever gone through in my life was seeing my father change from the upbeat, content man I had always known to someone who was irritable and short-tempered all the time. It seemed as though he had lost the very traits that had long characterized him due to the weight of his loss. I can very clearly recall those gloomy times when he would lie in bed all day. A far cry from the vivacious man he once was. His only outing would be to eat, and even then it would be a brief, nearly robotic ritual before he retired to the privacy of his bed. It was as if he had lost all interest in anything but his room. My mother would do everything she could to cheer him up. She would gently nudge him to get out of bed, suggesting that he take a stroll or maybe pick up some hobbies to help him decompress. She hoped that perhaps a diversion would help him escape the profound melancholy he was experiencing. However, my dad would frequently yell at her, ordering her to leave him alone, rather than giving her the despairing answer she was seeking. He was obviously struggling with feelings he didn't know how to manage because of the obvious pain and fury in his voice. My mother became our family's only provider during this trying time. She had always been dedicated to her work as a nurse at a nearby hospital, but she had to take on even more responsibility after my dad's business failed. The rent was past late, and the bills were mounting. She was forced to take on additional shifts at the hospital and frequently put in long hours in order to support us. Seeing her put herself through so much while balancing the responsibilities of her work and attempting to emotionally support our family was difficult. Although she never voiced any complaints, I could see the weight on her shoulders and the tiredness in her eyes. She was carrying a lot, and while I was concerned about how long she could go, I also respected her strength. There was always a heavy, unsaid strain in the air at home during that time, permeating every part of the house. Michael, my younger brother, and I tried our best to stay away from anything that would aggravate our parents, particularly our dad, whose mood had become so erratic. Now, Michael was always the more intelligent of the two of us, the type of child who was born with a natural aptitude for learning. He was a bit of a nerd, the kind of person who enjoyed spending his leisure time solving challenging puzzles and burying his nose in books. On the other hand, even though I excelled academically, my interests went beyond learning. In addition to my love of basketball, I also had a few other interests, which indicated that my grades fell short of Michael's. However, I always tried my hardest, and because my mom routinely monitored my grades, she had never had any problems with it until then. She recognized our differences and appreciated the work each of us put into our goals. However, our family's dynamic started to shift as my dad started to spend more and more time at home. He developed a sudden interest in our grades and would comment on how I obviously wasn't working as hard as Michael, highlighting the disparities between our academic performance. I recall him saying things like, "What's the point of studying at all if you're not going to be the best? They give up attending classes." His remarks were hurtful not only because they were cruel but also because it was obvious that they were a reflection of his own suffering and failure following the loss of his company. He seemed to be putting his sense of loss and inadequacy onto me. Even though I knew deep down that I wasn't the cause of his disillusionment, it still stung to see him so depressed and to feel that I was doing something to make him unhappy. I made an effort to concentrate more on my studies in the hopes of winning my dad over. However, it was never sufficient. My dad would swiftly discredit my mom's praise for my scores with insults, claiming that there was nothing to be proud of when the grades could have been far higher. My mother would initially attempt to defend me by telling him that I was trying my hardest and that any accomplishment, no matter how minor, should be acknowledged. However, something changed as time passed and my dad's taunts became more regular and severe. She began to mimic his parallels between Michael and me, slowly joining in. Almost every day, they both started telling me how much better my younger brother was doing than I was and how I needed to improve if I wanted to stay up with him. Almost every day, my father would remind me that I was never as good as Michael. The comparisons began to permeate every part of my existence and felt unrelenting. They eventually forbade me from participating in any after-school sports, including basketball. They advised me to focus entirely on my studies if I wanted to perform better in school. I had to give up my favorite sport as a result. The one thing that gave me the freedom and happiness to focus entirely on my studies in order to become as intelligent as my brother. But as my parents' limitations increased, I started to feel confined in my own house. I was always on edge, anticipating their next critique or analogy. I began to experience depression as a result of feeling as though my efforts would never be sufficient. Rest and relaxation were out of the question. It was basically a never-ending cycle of studying, fretting, and attempting to stay out of trouble. Despite the fact that I had already completed all of my homework, my dad would always check in with me to make sure I was studying. If I even took a brief break, he would make me feel bad. It was difficult to concentrate on anything, much less appreciate the things I used to love. Because of the oppressive strain, I learned to recognize my parents by the sound of their footsteps since I got so nervous around them. Pretending to be studying even though I had nothing left to study, I would quickly rush to cover my comic book with a textbook if I heard my dad approaching my room. I feared that he would accuse me of being lazy or not taking my studies seriously, and that I would be discovered squandering time. I was always afraid of disappointing them, and of being negatively compared to Michael. This dread and fear permeated every aspect of my life. I felt as though I had to tread carefully since I had no idea what I would be accused of, or when the next critique would arrive. Because they were now simply another source of stress, I started to lose interest in everything, including the things I used to enjoy. I no longer enjoyed learning new things or playing basketball. Instead, I felt guilty and inadequate. I deteriorated into a shell of my former self, always aiming for a more elusive approbation. I never felt like I was doing enough, even though I was following all of their instructions, which included studying more, giving up my hobbies, and attempting to be the best student possible. I felt more and more cut off from both them, and myself the more I attempted to live up to their expectations. Our family was still in a downward spiral a year after my dad's business failed. My mom was working herself to the bone, trying to hold everything together as the bills continued to mount, and my dad had not been able to find a new job. I realized then that my grandmother had paid me a visit. The difference in our lives must have been immediately apparent to her. We used to live in luxury, with all we needed and more, but these days it seemed like we were barely getting by, surviving day to day. Although I was unaware of it at the time, I believe my grandma had a serious conversation about our predicament with my dad. She must have realized how much it was affecting us all. The same day after my grandmother's visit, my parents sat me down for a chat, focusing on my mom, who was working non-stop, and my dad, who was still struggling with the loss of his business and his feeling of self-worth. Something was different. And I could tell immediately because of the intensity in their faces, which made my stomach turn. They informed me that after some discussion, they had reached a challenging conclusion. They were having too much trouble caring for my brother and me. I was surprised since I didn't really get what they were saying. I inquired about their meaning, my chest thumping with my heart. I had never seen my dad's eyes look so heavy before, and he said that my grandma had offered a solution that none of them wanted to think about. But they felt they had to. She had mentioned my uncle's desire to become a parent, even though he had no children of his own. To lessen the strain on my parents and provide one of us with a better shot at stability, he and his wife would be pleased to take care of one of us. When I heard this, I appeared perplexed. Then my mother spoke up, her voice shaking as she did so. She informed me that they felt it was best for Michael to remain with them in order to prevent any disruptions to his education, as he was the youngest and more academically oriented. They stated that they wanted me to move in with my uncle so they could take care of Michael and I could start over. I felt as though the earth had been lifted out from beneath me when I heard this. I felt hurt and astonished. The fact that they chose Michael over me and thought he was more deserving of their care and attention just because he was more gifted than I was made me feel rejected. Why they would send me away was beyond me. Why they believed that this kind of familial separation was acceptable. Despite all that had transpired, I had always given it my all, and now it felt as though none of that mattered. My dad shook his head, telling me that they just didn't have the money to raise 2 children. He also reassured me that I was a better fit for my uncle's family nonetheless. I started to cry and asked them if they no longer loved me and how I would work harder to improve my grades. As the eldest child, my mother attempted to explain that since Michael had a greater chance of becoming exceptional, I should accept this sacrifice without grumbling. I recall looking at them, attempting to comprehend their words. I experienced a range of feelings at that time, including betrayal, despair, rage, and an intense sense of loss. Although I was aware that things had been difficult, I never thought my parents would choose to send me away. I didn't know how to handle it. It felt like the last amount of stability I had was being snatched away. I could see that my parents were also struggling with this decision, but that didn't make it any less painful. When my uncle finally came to get me, I was forced to gather my things and move in with him. The weight of what was happening became nearly intolerable the day he arrived, when the situation's truth finally set in. When it was time to say goodbye to my brother, I recall crying a lot. The idea of not being together at home, and of not sharing the same space, was devastating, even though I knew I would still see him at school. Michael was also inconsolable. He was unable to comprehend our parents' actions, why we had already experienced so much together and they were separating us. I kept praying that this was all a horrible dream, and that when I woke up, everything would be as it had been. Sadly, though, there was no awakening from it. Before leaving me, my parents gave me a hug, and even though I could sense their remorse and anguish, it didn't make the hurt go away. I was aware of their difficulties and that they believed they were choosing what was best for everyone. However, knowing that didn't make saying goodbye any simpler. At the same time, I felt both familiar and oddly alien when I got to my uncle's house. I had spent a lot of time with my uncle and his wife over the years, and I felt at ease with them because they had always been friendly and hospitable. However, things were different this time. This was meant to be my new home, not just a visit. I couldn't help but wonder how long I would be living here, far from my brother and parents, and from my previous way of life. I was made to feel quite welcome by my uncle and his wife. They were considerate and made an effort to provide a seamless transfer. The hardest nights were the first few. The unfamiliarity of my surroundings would overwhelm me as I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. I missed my former room, the noises of my brother's activities next door, and even the floorboard creaks I had grown so accustomed to. Despite everything that had transpired, I still missed my parents. Even though the pain was still raw, I secretly wished for my family's familiarity and comfort. I tried to adapt and make the most of the circumstances as the months passed. My uncle and his spouse were really helpful, and made a special effort to make me feel welcome. At first it wasn't easy. There were times when I missed the comforts of my former life and felt homesick. However, I eventually realized the benefits of living with my uncle. One of the main distinctions was that my uncle didn't get upset with me over trivial matters as my dad did. I felt more relaxed and less nervous because he was understanding and tolerant. My aunt advocated a good balance even though she was tough about making sure I completed my assignments each day. Before everything changed, she would let me play basketball or hang out with my buddies after school. Being able to enjoy the things I liked without feeling pushed or guilty was a freeing experience. I was also pushed by my uncle and aunt to take up new interests and join other school clubs. They saw my ability not only as a student but also as a person with passions and interests outside of the classroom. Their support had a significant impact. My grades gradually improved as I began to feel more self-assured and driven. I started to truly like school and it stopped feeling like a chore. I was gradually regaining my feeling of purpose and excitement for the future in place of the worry and strain that had before devoured me. Every day at school I would run into my brother Michael, and we would spend time together as usual. He would update me on our parents' well-being and the daily routine at home. I occasionally experienced jealousy, particularly when he discussed the small activities they engaged in together. However, I also began to see that I was more at home with my aunt and uncle. The life I was creating there seemed right, and their house was turning into my home. In retrospect, I see that living with my uncle was among the best decisions I could have made. It was a pivotal moment that allowed me to rediscover my love of life and education, and the opportunity to become the person I wanted to be rather than the person I was supposed to be. In addition to marking the end of a chapter in my life, graduating from high school felt like a huge accomplishment because I had put in a lot of work and it had paid off. I received a partial scholarship and was accepted to my ideal university. I was quite relieved when my uncle, who was especially proud of me, offered to pay the remaining balance of my college tuition. My aunt, who is usually kind, even planned a little celebration to honor my accomplishments. With close relatives and friends, it was a cozy and private get-together. My parents were at the celebration, but they didn't appear very excited about my accomplishment. They didn't appear really thrilled about my college acceptance, instead pointing out, almost nonchalantly, that Michael might get accepted into a better university than mine in a few years. The sound of them saying that was odd and unnerving. I wanted to celebrate my accomplishments and feel like I had finally made them proud on this day. However, they appeared more interested in Michael's future potential than in my current achievement, rather than just praising me and letting me take advantage of the attention for a day. I didn't perceive this as a competition, which only made things more complicated. If Michael was accepted to a prestigious university and fulfilled his own aspirations, I would truly be delighted. I wanted the best for him because I loved him. However, the fact that my parents couldn't put aside their comparisons for even this one day to recognize my accomplishments and hard work without telling me that they loved my younger brother more was discouraging. I only had a few visits from my parents during my time at university. Every time they went somewhere, they would unavoidably talk about Michael. They would discuss his achievements, his potential, and their pride in him. But when it came time for Michael to start college, things took a surprising turn. In actuality, he had to take his second choice of university after being rejected from his first choice. His second choice wasn't the prominent university my parents had been hoping for, but it was still a good university. In order to brag about their younger son's superiority to the older one, they had been counting on his entrance into the prestigious institution. My parents were put in a challenging situation when Michael's college placement fell short of their expectations. They appeared to be frustrated that they could no longer utilize his accomplishments to contrast with or surpass mine. Their well-constructed story about Michael being the academic star was upended. They could no longer boast about him. My feelings of vindication were tempered by a twinge of sorrow for Michael. Even though my parents viewed him as a standard, he was still my brother. And I was aware that he had to have done everything in his power to get admitted into the greatest. My relationship with my parents remained tense over the years and eventually vanished completely. They hardly ever phoned, and I also stopped contacting them. I found a well-paying job across the nation when I graduated from college. Although I was apprehensive about accepting, my uncle and aunt urged me to try. I'm happy I took a gamble and relocated since it gave me the chance to save a lot of money and make wise investments. Because of my significant expertise, I was offered a top executive position at a large firm. 2 years ago, I fulfilled one of my greatest aspirations by buying my own house, and the pay increase has been more than enough to support a lavish lifestyle. Even though I'm not married or have kids yet, I've decided to use my money for the things that bring me joy and for myself. My uncle and aunt are still on my mind. As a thank you for everything they've done for me, I make sure to send them birthday and Christmas presents every year and stay in regular contact with them. Additionally, I've maintained contact with and support for my younger brother Michael. Michael told me some worrisome news last year. Because of the growing job crisis and the economic slump, he had lost his position at a tech business. Since then, he and a friend had been working on launching a business, but things weren't going as well as they had intended. He came to me for financial assistance because of the difficulties he was having and asked if I could invest in his company. Despite the fact that I lacked comprehensive knowledge of his company idea, I made the rash decision to invest in it. My main incentive was to express my solidarity with Michael. I wanted to help him get back on his feet since I knew how difficult the situation was for him. All I wanted was to get my brother's back, so I didn't even care if the business failed. My brother is extremely appreciative that I had faith in him when no one else did, and thankfully his business has begun to do well, even though it hasn't gone off yet. In honor of my grandmother's 75th birthday this year, my family made the decision to throw a lavish celebration. I was eagerly anticipating it, ready to get back in touch with everyone after a long absence. Eager to celebrate the milestone and see my family, I eagerly flew down. I've changed a lot over the years. The successful and pleasant life I have created for myself is reflected in my changing speech patterns, appearance, and sense of style. The changes clearly astonished my parents, who hadn't seen me in a decade and hadn't even tried to keep in contact. It felt great when my mom gave me a loving hug in an awkward way. And my father, however, appeared more taciturn. He casually began to inquire about my role and career, and as I gave him the information, I could see the astonishment in their eyes. My dad was surprised when I told him that I had even purchased a home for myself. He snorted and said he couldn't believe it, as if I couldn't accomplish anything so enormous. This infuriated me, so I told him that I would never pretend to be a homeowner, and that not everyone is a loser who has been dependent on his wife for years. My dad was caught off guard by this comment. But before he could reply, I said, "It was really painful growing up when you didn't believe in me no matter what I accomplished. It never seemed good enough. I was frequently criticized and compared to Michael. But I've grown out of that, young lad. For myself, I'm doing pretty well. I don't need to prove it to you, but the fact that you still fail to acknowledge my accomplishments in spite of everything I've done says more about your own anxieties than it does about me. You still have a hard time appreciating my accomplishment, and to be honest, that's your problem, not mine." My father appeared surprised because he obviously didn't think I would resist. I also told him that when Michael had no other options, I was the only one who had put money into his gifted son's company. My dad needed to wake up and start appreciating the person I had grown into. I was aware that my remarks were incisive and would probably cause pain. I could see the pain on his face, but since he had constantly disregarded me, I felt right in defending myself. My mom has been phoning me ever since the party to tell me how much my remarks hurt my dad. Since my remarks embarrassed him, she has requested me to apologize to him for my rudeness. She claims that I had no right to bring up the fact that he was still financially dependent on his mother. I have, in turn, refused to apologize to him or back down. AITA for telling my dad the truth? Just a few clarifications regarding Update 1. My dad's firm failed, and he never went back to work. He tried several different approaches. However, he disliked having a typical 9-to-5 job. Because of this, my mother has kept him financially supported while he assumes the role of house husband and occasionally works as a freelance consultant. I have a tense relationship with our parents, and Michael knows it. He has never taken part in or encouraged their partiality. My brother has always made an effort to help me whenever he can since he truly loves me. Michael wasn't yet old enough to be of any use when our parents sent me to live with my uncle. I believe that the primary reason my parents obviously don't like me is that I bring out their shortcomings. When times were hard, they obviously left me in the hopes that my departure would solve all of their issues or at the very least make their lives better. But as I flourished in my uncle's care, they still struggled financially. For them, it must have seemed like a slap in the face. They simply cannot comprehend the fact that I have achieved success in my life, as they never anticipated it. My parents were never forced to accept me back by my uncle or aunt, because they truly enjoyed having me around. Even though they never forced themselves on me and let me establish our relationship on my own, they still regard me as their son. My aunt and uncle have been really protective and affectionate toward me, and I believe this is because they have seen my parents' partiality for Michael over the years. They gave me everything my parents were never able to provide. Second update. I concur with many of you that I shouldn't have to apologize to my father for being impolite to me. I made the decision to send my parents an email expressing my feelings about them over the years, and my disappointment that they have never shown regret. I composed this email from the bottom of my heart, detailing every instance in which I could recall them failing me as my parents. I told them how much I needed them as a kid. But now, because they had always left me, I couldn't give a damn about them. They must have realized how much they had wounded me after reading my email, because my mother contacted me, sobbing and apologizing, saying she agreed with my dad and sent me to live with my uncle. She acknowledged that she hated herself after witnessing the anguish in my eyes whenever we met again, but she also stated that they had no other option at the moment. She acknowledged that one of the primary causes of her long-term estrangement was this remorse. I informed her that I no longer cared about her justifications because our relationship was irreparable, and I no longer thought of her and my father as my parents. My mother was really offended by this, and was urging me to move on so that we could start over. My dad hasn't tried to get in touch with me in the interim. However, after reading my email, my mother did say that he was emotional. All I can do is hope that he regrets what he did to me years ago. As I have always done in the past, I have decided to keep my distance from my parents for the time being. Update 3. I haven't posted anything here in a long time. I've experienced a sense of relief and emotional release ever since I sent my folks the email. Knowing that I finally told them what I wanted to say has been a cathartic experience, and I feel so much lighter today. My bond with my brother has remained intact. Regardless of my parents, I will continue to support him. I'm going to take my uncle and aunt to one of their favorite places for a much-needed vacation next month. I can't wait to show my aunt this property, which they have been talking about for years.